Hi there and welcome. Let's jump right into this deep dive. We've got, well, quite a stack of reports and analyses here, all focused on recent UK-US trade figures.
Yeah, and they really zoom in on one specific moment that kind of jumps off the page. A really surprising and frankly significant drop in UK exports over to the US back in April 2025.
Absolutely. So for you listening, our mission here is basically to unpack what these sources tell us happened and, get a handle on why it matters. Let's get into it.
Okay, so the big thing, the really central fact that leaps out from all this material is just the sheer size of the drop. UK goods exports to the US fell by a pretty dramatic £2 billion.
2 billion pounds, just in April 2025.
Just in that single month, yeah.
Wow. That sounds like, well, more than just a blip on the radar.
Oh, it definitely wasn't. The reports really emphasized this was the steepest monthly fall since they started keeping these records, which was way back in 1997. A sudden, very sharp decline.
Okay, right. So what did the analysis point to as the main reason, the primary driver for this sudden cliff edge?
The consensus, looking across these sources, seems to be the U.S. administration implementing what they called Liberation Day tariffs. And these went into effect that same month, April 2025.
Liberation Day tariffs. What did those actually involve?
It was a pretty major policy shift. You had a blanket 10% duty applied to, well, all UK goods going into the U.S.
10% on everything.
Everything. And then on top of that, extra tariffs, quite hefty ones, 25% slapped onto key sectors like steel, aluminum, and automobiles.
And the sources suggest this wasn't really flagged well in advance. Like, it was a pretty rapid change.
That's the impression you get, yes. While there might have been some, background noise or signals beforehand, the material really highlights that the scope and the suddenness of these tariffs. It caught businesses off guard. Very little time to adjust strategies or, supply chains.
So facing those kinds of duties, especially the higher 25% ones, which industries felt the immediate impact most sharply?
Well, naturally, the ones hit with those higher rates bore the brunt. The automotive industry, for example, looking at effectively a 27.5% tariff on cars, that caused major disruption.
27.5%. Wow.
Yeah, and some reports specifically mentioned companies like Jaguar Land Rover actually temporarily halting exports completely.
Pausing exports altogether, that really does underline how severe this was on the ground.
It does. And the steel and aluminum sectors, they also face significant problems because of their 25% tariffs. When big industries like that get hit, the effects ripple outwards pretty quickly.
Which the broader economic data then showed, I assume.
Exactly. The immediate fallout for the UK economy as a whole was a 0.3% contraction in GDP just for April.
Okay.
And the analysis pointed out this was actually the largest single monthly decline going back to October 2023. If you break it down, that GDP drop included a 0.6% fall in manufacturing and a 0.4% dip in services. So pretty widespread impact.
Right. Facing that kind of economic hit, what do the reports say the UK government did in response?
They show the government engaging in negotiations with the U.S. pretty quickly. And that did lead to some partial relief starting in May.
Partial relief. Okay, what sort of specifics did the sources mention there?
Well, for cars, the tariff was brought down to 10%. But importantly, that came with a cap. It only applied to the first 100,000 vehicles each year.
Ah, okay. A quota system then.
Kind of, yeah. And the good news for steel and aluminum was that those extra tariffs were removed completely.
So some specific wins, particularly for steel and aluminum, but not a complete rollback across the board.
Precisely. The analysis makes it clear that while those sectors got relief, many others are still facing that baseline 10% tariff that came in back in April. Getting more comprehensive relief is still an ongoing effort, according to these sources.
And I think the sources also mentioned something else happening domestically around the same time, something that made things even trickier for businesses.
Yes, and this is where it gets, well, particularly complicated for companies on the ground. The material highlighted UK domestic policy changes also kicking in during April.
Like what?
Specifically, things like increases in employer national insurance contributions, basically making it more expensive to employ people, and also rises in minimum wage rates.
Ah, okay. So businesses were getting squeezed externally by these new U.S. tariffs and internally by rising operating costs at the same time.
That's the picture painted by the reports. That combination seems to have put significant extra pressure on firms right when they were trying to deal with the trade shock.
So Looking beyond just that initial month, what are the broader consequences or implications that the sources are pointing to?
Well, this whole environment, the uncertainty, the higher costs, it seems to be dampening business confidence. That translates into things like reduced investment plans and maybe holding back on hiring.
Is there a specific figure in the reports that sort of captures that wider impact?
Yes, actually, the British Chambers of Commerce reported a number that's cited here, a 14.6% year-on-year fall in goods exports to the U.S. in April.
14.6% year on year.
Yeah. So while the monthly drop was that £2 billion figure we started with, that year-on-year comparison really gives you a sense of the broader trend and the challenging environment businesses found themselves in.
Right. So, given this really complex picture, what kind of strategies or ways forward did the sources suggest? For businesses, for policymakers?
For businesses, the main theme coming through was resilience, often through
Exactly.
diversification. Actively looking for alternative markets beyond just the U.S., maybe rethinking supply chains.
Makes sense. And for policymakers?
Well, obviously continuing to push for better trade agreements, but also, critically, looking at the domestic side, the regulatory environment, the cost base to make sure UK businesses aren't facing unnecessary internal burdens, especially when dealing with external shocks like these tariffs.
It really does paint a vivid picture of how international trade can be quite vulnerable to sudden policy shifts and how that gets tangled up with the domestic economic climate.
It absolutely does, and it kind of leaves you, the listener, with a fascinating question to mull over, doesn't it? How deeply do these sudden changes in access to global markets interact with the country's own internal economic policies? How do those two forces combine to shape the real-world fate of businesses and, ultimately, a nation's trade performance?
A lot to think about indeed. Well, thank you for walking us through these sources in this deep dive.
Always interesting to unpack this stuff. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us. We hope this gave you a clearer understanding of the forces behind those dramatic UK-US trade figures from April 2025. Goodbye for